All right. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Maryland State Commission on Criminal Sentencing Policies, Sentencing Guidelines, and MAGS 101 orientation for law clerks and court staff. My name is Catherine Pembroke. I'm the Administrative and Training Coordinator for the Sentencing Commission. Now, the sentencing guidelines play a significant role in supporting fair and proportional sentencing practice. Accordingly, we thank you for participating in this training because court staff and judicial law clerks, you all have a really important role in helping to ensure the consistent application and submission of sentencing guidelines worksheets. So I do want to note that today's webinar is being recorded, and either this video or a similar webinar recording will be made available on our training website at the end of the training. So let's talk a little bit about the agenda for today's training. Now, this session is geared more so towards newer law clerks and court staff, but I know that there are some here for a bit of a refresher, which is fantastic. But since the concept of the guidelines may be somewhat new to some of you, I thought it'd be helpful by starting the presentation with just a basic overview of the sentencing guidelines in general. And then throughout the course of the presentation, we're also going to be reviewing some frequently asked questions that cover sentencing guidelines eligibility. We're going to review what constitutes a guidelines compliant sentence. That's going to be really helpful to keep in mind when it comes to MAGS. And then finally, we're going to wrap up with a demonstration in our Maryland Automated Guideline System, commonly referred to as MAGS. And the demonstration, it's going to include a specific emphasis on some relatively recent features that were deployed in MAGS. So if we get to a topic that may be relevant to a question you have, I have a lot of material kind of crammed into this 1 hour session, but I do have my colleagues here with me who are going to be monitoring the chat box. So if you have any questions throughout the course of the presentation, we certainly encourage you to submit them through the chat box, and then my colleagues will respond to you, and I'll be happy to take any outstanding questions at the end of the training as well. Okay, so let's begin with a quick review here. What is the purpose of sentencing guidelines? The sentencing guidelines are a mechanism to encourage proportional sentences. The primary goal of the guidelines is to promote consistent, fair, and equitable sentencing practices, whereby offenders who are adjudicated of similar offenses with similar criminal histories, they're treated and sentenced alike. Now, Maryland sentencing guidelines were designed to systematically account for the most common variations in offenders and their offenses. The sentencing guidelines help achieve proportional sentencing by identifying and assigning weights to core objective factors for consideration by judges in making sentencing decisions. And they really help to provide a framework to allow judges to consistently assign the same value or score as their colleagues around the state for each of these legitimate legal factors. Now, the guidelines provide a baseline for judges by offering a recommended range based on the average sentence for a typical case. And then finally, the guidelines help to improve sentencing transparency as they are a matter of public record, and the data collected via the sentencing guidelines worksheet are publicly accessible. Now let's talk a little bit about the purpose of the guidelines worksheet itself. It serves two main purposes. The first purpose of the worksheet is to inform the judge of the guidelines prior to sentencing. So Criminal Procedure Article 6-216 indicates that the court shall consider the guidelines at sentencing. And in order to do so, a sentencing guidelines worksheet must be prepared. The second purpose of the worksheet is to provide data, so the commission can make informed decisions about sentencing policy. So Criminal Procedure Article 6-210 requires the Sentencing Commission to collect sentencing guidelines worksheets, automate the information, and monitor sentencing practice. This is why it's especially important that we're getting as many guidelines worksheets as possible to help inform sentencing policy. Now, Maryland's guidelines are scored on two key factors, that being the prior record and the seriousness of the offense. In the Maryland system, an offender score is calculated to account for an offender's prior criminal record. The offender score is a summary scale ranging from 0 to 9, which measures an offender's criminal history, accounting for 4 factors, that being relationship to the criminal justice system at the time of the instant offense, juvenile delinquency record, prior adult criminal record, and then finally, prior adult parole and or probation violations. The second component of the sentencing guidelines is the offense seriousness, represented in Maryland by the offense score. Now, for property and drug offenses, the offense ranking is based solely on the seriousness offense. But for person offenses, so those typically involving victims as well as weapon-related offenses, the offense score is calculated by considering 3 additional factors, that being victim injury, which can be physical or psychological. So 1 point is scored here for a non-permanent injury, 2 points for a permanent injury or death. Weapon presence, which is the presence of any article or device that reasonably appears capable of causing injury. So 1 point is scored here for a weapon other than a firearm, 2 points for a firearm or an explosive. And then finally, special victim vulnerability. This refers to cases in which the status of the victim tends to render the actions of the offender more serious. So 1 point is scored if the victim is younger than 11 or older than 64, or if they have a physical or mental disability. All right, so let's start talking about guidelines eligibility a little bit. We're going to discuss the scenarios in which a worksheet is and is not required. So just a general question to get us started. Do Maryland sentencing guidelines apply to misdemeanors? The answer here, yes. The sentencing guidelines apply to guidelines eligible misdemeanors and felonies that are prosecuted in a circuit court. Now, there's been some confusion in recent years. Some practitioners thinking that the guidelines are limited to felonies, but that's not true. The guidelines apply to both guidelines eligible misdemeanors and felonies prosecuted in a circuit court. So let's take a look at the scope of the sentencing guidelines in greater detail here, just so you can keep in mind any upcoming sentencing hearings if they might be guidelines eligible and require submission of a guidelines worksheet. So as I just noted, Maryland sentencing guidelines apply to criminal cases that are prosecuted in a circuit court. Now, the sentencing matters that you see on the left-hand side here, we refer to these as guidelines eligible sentencings. So these include circuit court original sentencings, jury trial prayers and appeals from the district court, but only when a pre-sentence investigation is ordered. Cases adjudicated via probation before judgments. So this also includes the new type of PBJ pursuant to Criminal Procedure Article 6-220 subsection C. Then, in addition to original sentencings, we also collect worksheets for reconsiderations, modifications, and 3-judge panel reviews, provided that the sentencing event involves a crime of violence and there was an adjustment made to the original active sentence as a result of that recent reconsideration or modification. Now, on the right-hand side here, these are matters that you'll also see handled in a circuit court, but they are excluded from guidelines coverage. So those are jury trial prayers or appeals from the district court with no PSI, offenses that carry no possibility of incarceration, violations of local laws and municipal ordinances, probation violation hearings, criminal non-support, contempt, and also desertion, juvenile court adjudications, and then finally district court sentencings. So let's take a look at a couple of offenses in particular that I get questions about. So as I just noted, violations of local laws and municipal ordinances, they are excluded from guidelines coverage. And in particular, I get questions about this violation of Baltimore City Code 59-2, which involves the discharging of a firearm. Now, it gets a little confusing because even though this offense does carry the possibility of incarceration, again, it's a violation of local law or Baltimore City Code, which is why it is not guidelines eligible. So if it were being sentenced with other guidelines eligible offenses, it just wouldn't be reflected on the guidelines worksheet. Now, the next group of offenses are Code of Maryland regulations, which are COMAR violations. They are generally not guidelines eligible. And these can also cause some confusion because oftentimes they do carry the possibility of incarceration. Now, I do want to note it can get a little tricky because it's possible there may be an exception if the penalty for a COMAR violation is actually outlined in state statute as opposed to COMAR itself. But again, generally COMAR violations are not guidelines eligible. But if there's ever a question, I know there have been some law clerks who have reached out to question COMAR violations in the past. Always feel free to contact our office and we can help determine the eligibility. And then lastly, I just want to note that effective October 1 of 2025, reckless driving now carries the possibility of incarceration and therefore has become a guidelines eligible offense. So prior to October 1, it didn't carry incarceration, which is why it wouldn't be reflected on the worksheet. However, moving forward, it's now a guidelines eligible offense. Now, I also want to note that we've worked with JIS to establish this guidelines eligible case indicator. So here's a screenshot of the Circuit Court for Anne Arundel County's criminal docket from earlier this month here. And you can see all the upcoming cases have this MAGS yes indicator. That's indicating it's a guidelines eligible case, which would require a worksheet. Now, we've worked with JIS to really perfect the criteria here, but that said, sometimes this flag, it may be flagged yes, perhaps inaccurately. So just keeping in mind all the criteria that we just reviewed regarding guidelines eligibility. I definitely encourage you to refer to these dockets. Based on conversations I've had with court staff and law clerks, they do find the eligibility flag to be particularly helpful, just so you know which upcoming cases will require submission of a guidelines worksheet. All right, so here's another question, just kind of in general about guidelines eligibility. So if the Appellate Court of Maryland has remanded a criminal case back to the respective circuit court for a resentencing, is a sentencing guidelines worksheet required? So the answer is no. A guidelines worksheet would not be required when the Appellate Court of Maryland remands a case back for resentencing. Now, a remand back for a resentencing, that's a different type of sentencing matter than that of a reconsideration, modification, or three-judge panel review. So this is why a guidelines worksheet would not be required in this scenario. But just to note, if the appellate court was remanding a case back for a new trial, we would require a worksheet for the new trial. Again, ever a question about guidelines eligibility, always feel free to contact us. Okay, so let's talk about guidelines compliance in general here. Common question I receive, why is MAGS flagging the overall sentence as a departure from the guidelines? So maybe you're logging into MAGS, you're entering sentence information, anticipating a compliant sentence, and you don't understand why MAGS is flagging it as a departure. And the answer, most likely, is that it is not a guidelines compliant sentence. So let's take a look at what constitutes guidelines compliant sentences. Now, a sentence is deemed compliant with the guidelines if the guidelines applicable sentence, which is defined as the sum of incarceration, credited time, and home detention time, falls within the applicable guidelines range. So generally, suspended time is not considered when determining whether a sentence is compliant. There's one exception involving corrections options, which we're going to talk about in a moment here. But again, generally, it's the sum of incarceration, credited time, and home detention time that's used to determine compliance. Now, I also want to note that compliance is calculated by comparing the overall sentence across all adjudicated offenses in a sentencing event to the overall guidelines range for that sentencing event. So it's possible the sentence could exceed the upper guidelines limit for one offense, fall below the lower guidelines limit for the second offense. But the overall sentence, when taking into concurrent versus consecutive, it could still fall within the overall guidelines range for that sentencing event. So let's take a quick look at some examples of guidelines compliant and non-compliant sentences. So here's a screenshot of our matrix here for property offenses. And let's take a look at example number 1, which is a compliant sentence. So let's say the recommended guidelines range is 6 months to 1 year, which you see highlighted here. And let's say the sentence imposed was 2 years, suspend all but 9 months active incarceration. Now, this would be considered a guidelines compliant sentence because, again, that guidelines applicable sentence, sum of incarceration, credit and home detention of 9 months, falls within that recommended range. Whereas in example number 2, same guidelines range of 6 months to 1 year. Let's say we have a sentence of 2 years, suspend all but 3 months. That 3-month guidelines applicable sentence falls below the overall guidelines range of 6 months to 1 year. Now, there are a few qualifiers to consider regarding guidelines compliance. The first is that sentences adjudicated pursuant to an MSCCSP binding plea agreement are automatically deemed guidelines compliant. Now, binding pleas are 3-party agreements in which the state and the defense present to the court on the record an agreement that incorporates a specific sentence. An MSCCSP binding plea agreement means an agreement to a specific amount of active time, if any, not merely a sentence cap or range. The court has the discretion to accept or reject the plea, but the agreement becomes binding on the court under Maryland Rule 4-243, subsection C, if the court accepts the plea. So let's take all of that information and apply it towards some sample cases here. In sample case number 1, let's say we have a recommended guidelines range of 2 years to 8 years. Let's say there was an agreement presented to a sentence range anywhere from probation to 2 years. The court accepted the agreement and sentenced the defendant to 3 years, suspend all but 1 year. Would this constitute an MSCCSP binding plea agreement? And the answer in this scenario is no. So as a reminder, an MSCCSP binding plea, it must involve an agreement to a specific amount of active time, not merely a sentence range or cap. So in this scenario, the court accepted a plea agreement to a sentence range anywhere from probation to 2 years. And this is why it would not constitute an MSCCSP binding plea. Let's look at sample case number 2. Let's say the guidelines are 1 year to 6 years. The agreement presented was for 5 years, all suspended with credit for 62 days. The court accepted the agreement and sentenced the defendant to 5 years, all suspended with credit for 62 days. Is this an MSCCSP binding plea agreement? The answer here, yes. So in this scenario, there was an agreement to a specific amount of active time, that being 0, or in other words, no post-sentence incarceration. Therefore, this would constitute an MSCCSP binding plea agreement. So all of this is just important to keep in mind when you're selecting the disposition type in MAGS, because as we've just discussed, MSCCSP binding plea agreements, it does affect guidelines compliance. So we want to make sure we're marking those disposition types accurately based on the circumstances of the plea agreement. All right, so moving on to the role of corrections options. Now, sentences to corrections options programs are deemed compliant provided that the initial sentence plus any suspended sentence, so essentially as long as the total sentence falls within or above the applicable guidelines range, and the case does not include a crime of violence, child sex abuse, or escape. So this is the one exception I mentioned earlier in which suspended time is considered for determining a guidelines compliant sentence. Now, corrections options allow judges to utilize a broader range of alternatives to incarceration while still remaining compliant with the sentencing guidelines. So corrections options include home detention, inpatient residential treatment, inpatient drug or alcohol counseling under Health General 8-505 or 507, drug court, problem-solving courts, required substance abuse treatment for the possession, administration, obtainment, etc. of CDS, work release, and weekend or other discontinuous incarceration. So here's a question relating to guidelines compliance and the role of corrections options. Now, do I need to mark a corrections option program, for example, drug court, if the defendant successfully completed the program prior to sentencing in their respective case? And the answer is yes. So pre-sentence participation in drug court or any other problem-solving court should be reflected in MAGS. And again, it's important that it is because corrections options do factor into guidelines compliance. All right, so let's take a look at a sentencing scenario number 3 here involving corrections options. Let's say the guidelines are 1 year to 3 years. The sentence is a 6-year total sentence, all of which is suspended. The defendant was also sentenced to drug court, a corrections option program. Now, which of the following best describes the sentence imposed? Is this a departure below the guidelines, departure above, or a guidelines compliant sentence? And the answer here, it is a guidelines compliant sentence. So again, sentences to corrections options programs, they're compliant provided that that total sentence falls within or above the applicable guidelines range. So in this case here, even though this was a 6-year total sentence, all of which was suspended. So technically that guidelines applicable sentence we were talking about is 0, which would make it look like it's a below departure from the 1 year to 3 years. The fact that a corrections option program was utilized, now we're looking to the total sentence here, which is 6 years, and that is falling within or above this recommended range of 1 year to 3 years. This is why it is deemed a guidelines compliant sentence. And then the last rule regarding calculation of guidelines compliance is that sentences in which the offender received credit for time served with no post-sentence incarceration time, and if the amount of credited time exceeds the guidelines range, it's going to be deemed guidelines compliant. So for example, if the guidelines range is probation to 3 months, the defendant was sentenced to 6 months fully suspended with credit for 100 days, the sentence would still be guidelines compliant even though that credited time exceeds the upper guidelines limit. Okay, so next we're going to be turning to the MAGS demonstration. That's going to be the bulk of this training here because we're going to walk through a bunch of different sentencing scenarios, how to input different offenses. I'm going to make different selections so we can see how those changes affect guidelines compliance. But before I do that, I just want to quickly provide a screenshot of our MAGS homepage. I just want to note that we do have a bunch of instructional and support materials on the MAGS homepage here. We have instructional videos, a MAGS user manual, and FAQs. So if you ever have questions about MAGS, you can feel free to utilize these materials. If you have a new colleague on board, these would certainly be helpful to refer them to. And then as you can see, MAGS can also be accessed from our MAGS homepage here. So at this point, if you can just give me a moment here, I'm going to go and bring up MAGS. And we will go from there. Bear with me 1 second here. Okay, so hopefully we should be seeing the MAGS home screen here. Now, I believe most of you are already familiar with your credentials. And so I'm just going to go ahead and log in. Okay. So after logging in, you're always brought to our MAGS home screen, and it's from the home screen where users can either create a new worksheet or view, edit, or delete an existing one. Now, one feature I want to point out before we actually get into a previously initiated case and start entering some sentence information is this reconsideration, modification, or three-judge review for COV sentences feature. So as I mentioned earlier in the training, in addition to original sentencings, we collect worksheets for these types of scenarios, the reconsideration, modification, or three-judge review for crimes of violence. Now, prior to that upcoming reconsideration modification, ideally the state's attorney is initiating the worksheet prior to that reconsideration. However, I want to show you how this feature works because if 1 month perhaps you got our MAGS report, you know that one of your judge's cases was flagged as outstanding, actually a worksheet needing to be initiated, and you see that it was a reconsideration or modification. If you have trouble getting a hold of the state's attorney, maybe they're on leave, maybe you're just having trouble getting a hold of them in general, I want to show you how you can essentially copy the original worksheet for the upcoming reconsideration. It's a very easy step, and then you can move forward with entering the modified sentence information, cross that off your list. So as I just mentioned, in order for this feature to work, the worksheet that was submitted for the original sentencing has to have been submitted in MAGS, which many jurisdictions have been utilizing MAGS for several years at this point. So there's a good chance that original worksheet was submitted in MAGS. And by guidelines rule, the guidelines for the upcoming reconsideration should be the same as they were calculated for the original sentencing event. So that's why this feature kind of streamlines the whole worksheet initiation process and allows you to essentially copy the original guidelines calculation. So let's walk through how this feature works really quick. If I were to go ahead and click a little check mark in the reconsideration box, you can see a lot of the search fields become disabled, and then I'm searching by case number. So I'm going to go ahead and search for a previously submitted worksheet here. Okay, so you can see once I plugged that case number in, I get a return for a John Smith with a case number ending in 1111. I can see that it was sentenced back in 2023, and I can also see this little check mark under the submitted column. That's how I can tell that it was submitted. Now, on the left-hand side here, you all will see two icons. Now, as judges designees, you have read-only access to submitted worksheets. So if you're looking up a submitted worksheet, you'll see this little download icon. That gives you the ability to view the submitted worksheet. There's also going to be this copy icon, which is what you would utilize if you were copying the original worksheet for an upcoming reconsideration modification. So if I were to click that button, I'm going to confirm that I want to copy it. And once I do that, you can see I'm brought to the offender information tab. And much of the information that you'll see on offender information, offender score, list of offenses, that pre-populates based on the information that was submitted on the original worksheet. So you would essentially just enter your name as the worksheet preparer and then title. We can say law clerk here. And then if there were differences regarding PSI status or representation, you could make those changes here. But again, much of the information is going to pre-populate and be disabled based on what was submitted in the original sentencing event. So then you would essentially just click Save this page and then proceed to victim information and the rest of the sentencing related tabs here. So that's how that feature works. Wanted to point that out, but I'm going to move back to the home screen here. And now we're going to search for a previously initiated case and start entering some sentence information. Now, as you can see, you can search several ways. You can filter by jurisdiction, state identification number, first name, last name, case number, and then we're going to talk about worksheet ID in a moment here. So I already went ahead and initiated a sample test case. So I'm going to filter by Prince George's County, and then I'm going to search for my defendant, Edward Smith, and click search here. Okay, so you can see once I do that, I get a return for two different case numbers, 1122 and then 2255. Now, when there are multiple criminal events, which often have different case numbers, they often have different offense dates. If those multiple case numbers are being sentenced in front of the same judge on the same day, they constitute one sentencing event, meaning that one set of sentencing guidelines should be initiated for that event. Again, meaning that the state's attorney or parole and probation agent should be clicking this add new button one time and then adding all of the unique case number information for the entire sentencing event to the list of offenses tab. Now, if a multiple criminal event single sentencing event is initiated correctly, when you all go to search the system, sometimes if you know what's a multiple criminal event single sentencing event scenario, it might be helpful just to search generally for the defendant here. And then you should see all of these unique case numbers populating. They should share the same worksheet ID number. That's how you know a multiple criminal event, single sentencing event scenario was initiated properly. Now, let's say you search the system, you do see these two case numbers, but they actually have different worksheet ID numbers. You know they were sentenced in front of the same judge on the same day. So you're going to run into two issues. The first and the most important issue is that when the state or parole and probation initiates multiple criminal events, single sentencing event scenarios separately, the judge isn't presented a proper overall guidelines range prior to sentencing. That's the first issue. The second issue is going to come into play when you all go to submit the worksheets. And I know some of you have probably already encountered this. But what happens is you're able to enter all of the sentence information. You're even able to successfully submit the first worksheet. When you go to submit the second worksheet, you're going to get a duplicate error message saying there's already been a worksheet that contains the same SID number, date of birth, and date of sentence. And then you contact us. We're able to combine the worksheets for you and send you back a revised PDF. But I mention all this because it's good to get ahead of the issue prior to you even entering sentence information. It's going to save you time. So what I would suggest doing, if you're searching the system for a multiple criminal event, single sentencing event scenario, and you do notice those worksheet ID numbers differ, I would encourage you to actually reach out to the state's attorney and ask them to combine the worksheets for you before you even start entering sentence information. Again, one, that's going to save you time. And two, it's a good reminder to the state's attorney so that they know that's how a multiple criminal event, single sentencing event scenario should be initiated moving forward. Now, I do want to note that last year we were able to implement an alert in MAGS to hopefully prompt state's attorneys to correctly initiate multiple criminal event, single sentencing event scenarios. So just to give you a quick rundown, for example, if they had initiated this first case number, one worksheet ID, and then went and created a second worksheet ID for the second case number, when they went to save the information, it would give them a duplicate worksheet message saying, hey, wait a second, there's already another existing worksheet ID that contains much of the same information. Are these cases going to be sentenced together? If so, they should be combined. So I do think that has helped at least cut down on the number of instances we've seen with multiple criminal events, single sentencing event scenarios being initiated incorrectly. So just to let you all know, we do have that feature in place to prompt them to correctly initiate this type of scenario, but always good to pay attention to the worksheet ID field as well. Now, the last thing I want to note before we move on to entering sentence information, just from the home screen here, again, since these case numbers are linked by the same worksheet ID number, let's say in this 2255 case number, there was one offense, it ended up being merged or null prost. Now, by guidelines rule, any merged or null prost offense should be removed from the guidelines worksheet. But I just want to note, you don't want to delete it from the home screen here. You want to do it from the list of offenses tab, which I'm going to show you in a minute here. But just to note, if you were to click the trash can icon next to that case number from the home screen, it's going to delete the entire worksheet ID, which don't panic. Our staff has the ability to restore the worksheet. So you can always contact us if you accidentally do delete a worksheet ID. But again, just something to keep in mind. Okay, so at this point, I'm going to go ahead and click on my edit icon, and we are going to start entering some sentence information. So you can see once I do that, you're brought to the offender information tab. And as you can see up here, MAGS is divided into 8 tabs or screens, each of which represents a different section of the guidelines worksheet. So generally, offender information, offender score, list of offenses, and most of victim information, a lot of that should be completed, pretty much all of that should be completed by the state's attorney prior to sentencing. And then you all are responsible for completing the victim information, sentence, GLS overall sentence, alternatives to incarceration, and finally departure and submit. Now, let's quickly jump back to the list of offenses tab here. I mentioned just a moment ago that merged or null prost offense should be removed from the guidelines worksheet. Now, ideally, the state should be removing those from the guidelines worksheet for you prior to you even getting in and start entering sentence information, but sometimes that doesn't happen in a timely manner. So I just want to show you how to delete a merged or null prost offense. It's very quick, very simple. So to do so, you would do that from the list of offenses tab. Now, before I show you, I actually want to note that the list of offenses and sentence tab, they look pretty much identical. So I've gotten a lot of phone calls from users saying, I'm deleting this offense. I don't understand why it's not actually deleting from the worksheet. And the answer is that you're trying to delete it from the sentence tab, and you actually need to delete the offense from the list of offenses tab. So just make sure you're on this particular tab when going to delete merged or null prost offenses. So in this sentencing event here, let's just say count number 5 ended up being null prost. So I want to remove it from the worksheet. To do that, I simply click on the trash can icon next to that corresponding offense, confirm I want it deleted, and then I just click save this page. That's it. And then you can move on here. All right, so let's move forward to victim information. Again, ideally, much of this information is completed by the state prior to sentencing. That said, some of these fields cannot be completed until post-sentencing. So we ask that you fill in these fields when applicable here. So that's whether the victim was present at sentencing and whether they gave a written or oral victim impact statement here. You can make those selections. And then we can move on to the next tab here. All right, so here we have our sentence tab. Again, we see all of our offenses listed individually here. And we will simply begin by entering individual sentence information. So I'm going to start by clicking my edit icon next to the murder first degree, which is going to bring me to the offense sentence tab. Now, throughout MAGS, you will see red asterisks next to certain fields. Those are mandatory fields. They require some sort of value to be entered before you can ultimately save the tab and move forward. So on this particular tab here, we can see total sentence, suspend all but, credit for time served, home detention, and then consecutive status. Those are all mandatory fields. And based on what you enter in these first 4 sentence-related fields, MAGS is automatically going to calculate that guidelines applicable sentence for you. Now, for murder first degree, you're always going to see that MAGS automatically flags the life box. That's because statutorily, a life sentence must be imposed for a murder first degree conviction. It can be suspended, but at a minimum, it has to be imposed. So that's why MAGS will automatically flag that for you. Now, for MAGS purposes and guidelines compliant purposes, we had to assign some sort of value to life, which is why you see 100 years populating as the total sentence for this life sentence. So life equals 100 years, which means if this were a flat life sentence, none of which was imposed, you would enter that as life, suspend all but 100 years. Now, the suspend all but field, that includes any active jail, prison, credit, or home detention time. Now, in this particular case, I'm actually going to go ahead and enter a partially suspended sentence. So this is going to be life, suspend all but 85 years, and then 182 days credit for time served. Now, I also want to note that we have this days calculator. Sometimes when you're referring to hearing sheets, you'll see the sentence referenced as, sentence to start as of, and it's a date that's preceding the actual sentence date. And that generally means that credit is calculated from that sentence start date to the actual sentence date. So if you have those two different dates, you could plug these in, click calculate days, and MAGS would automatically calculate the number of days for you. And then moving down to home detention, I'm going to go ahead and plug in 0 there. Now moving down, I have to note if the sentence for this offense is consecutive to another count in the sentencing event. Now, if it were running consecutively, if I would mark yes, you'll see MAGS gives you a little reminder, an alert message stating if one count is to be served consecutively to another, that yes must be selected for both counts in order for the sentences to be summed to obtain the total sentence length. Now, if all the sentences are running concurrent, or if there's only one offense in the sentencing event, you can mark no in response to this question. And actually, on the topic of concurrent and consecutive sentences, I want to note something about credit for time served. Now, if all of the sentences in the sentencing event are running concurrent, you can reflect that credit for time served in all of the concurrent sentences. However, if you have sentences that are running consecutively, you only want to reflect that full amount of credit in for one of the sentences. Otherwise, if you entered it in for all of the sentences, MAGS is going to add that credit up across all of the offenses that are flagged as running consecutively. It's going to give you a much higher number, and you don't want to do that. So again, concurrent sentences, it's fine to enter credit for time served for all of them. Consecutive sentences, make sure you're reflecting credit in for one of those. Okay, jumping back down here, you'll note whether a probation before judgment was granted. I'm going to go ahead and mark no. Whether the defendant was convicted as a subsequent offender, and whether restitution was proven. I'm going to mark no for this particular offense. And then you're going to click save this page and close. And you can see once I successfully save that information, there's a little check mark under the entered column. All right, so moving on to the burglary first degree here, again, going to bring the offense sentence screen back up here. Now, let's say I'm entering a 10-year sentence and I'm suspending all but 182 days credit for time served. So here I begin by entering 10 years as the total sentence. And then I'm entering the 182 days in the suspend all but field because it's suspending all but that credit for time served. Then I'm also specifying that amount of credit in the credit for time served field. Again, entering 0 from the home detention. These are running concurrently, so I'm going to mark no. There was no PBJ, no subsequent offender. And we'll say no for this one as well. We're going to enter restitution on another offense. Okay, two sentences down. So let's move forward with the distribution of heroin here. All right, so for this particular offense, I am going to enter a fully suspended sentence with no credit for time served. It's going to be 5 years, fully suspended, no credit for time served. So to begin, I'm going to go ahead and enter 5 years in the total sentence field. Now, this type of sentence, it takes a minute to kind of wrap your head around it. But when you have a fully suspended sentence with no credit for time served, you want to enter 0 in the suspend all but field. Because again, that field is capturing any active jail, prison, credit, or home detention. With a fully suspended sentence, there's no jail, prison, credit, or home detention. So 0 is what the value that you would want to enter in the suspend all but field. And then again, I'm entering 0 for credit for time served, 0 for home detention. Now these are concurrent, no subsequent offender, no restitution. So saving this page and close. All right, then last we have our felony theft, at least $1,500, but less than $25,000. So I'm going to go ahead and bring up this offense sentence. All right, so in this sentence, we're going to talk about home detention. So I am going to enter 1 year to be served on home detention with credit for 182 days. So let's talk about what that would look like. I'm going to begin by entering my 1 year total sentence, and then I'm suspending all but 1 year because that's 1 year served on home detention. And then there's 182 days credit. So I'm plugging that in the credit for time served field. Now, when you have credit for time served and a period of home detention, this is the only time where you're going to have to do a little bit of math because the sum of credit for time served and home detention, they have to equal the suspend all but field, which means you're going to have to subtract the credit for time served from the home detention. Now, the easiest way to do that, because we capture credit for time served in days, would be to convert the home detention into days and then subtract this number. So in this scenario, I have the 1 year home detention, so that's 365 days. I'm subtracting the 182 days from there. So I'm going to go ahead and plug in 183 days in the home detention, and that's still giving me that full 1 year guidelines applicable sentence, which is correct. Now, again, these are concurrent, no PBJ, no subsequent offender, but this is a theft-related offense, and there was some restitution ordered. So I'm going to go ahead and mark yes, and then enter 2,000. Now, if you know that restitution will be ordered, but you don't know what that amount is, perhaps there's a restitution hearing that's going to happen a little bit down the line. You can always select yes and then check unknown amount. And then you're going to click save here. And then close. Okay, so at this point in time, I have all of my sentences entered, but let's say maybe you were hurrying, you entered some sentence information incorrectly, and you want to go ahead and delete it. You want to start over for a particular offense. You can actually delete the sentence information by clicking this little trash can icon. It's going to ask you to confirm you want to clear it and click yes. And you can see once I do that, that little check mark disappears. So then we're going to jump back into this felony theft. So I'm going to talk about two other scenarios here. So let's talk about this generally suspended flag. You can see if I were to check this flag, all of the sentence fields pre-populate with 0. Because when a sentence is generally suspended, there's usually no other sentence imposed with it. However, you do not want to check this generally suspended flag unless the judge explicitly stated on the record that the sentence was generally suspended. Sometimes there isn't any formal sentence imposed, but that's different than generally suspended. So again, you want to make sure it's something the judge is stating on the record before you check this in MAGS. Now, another common scenario you may encounter are probation before judgments, which also typically do not have other sentences imposed. But because these are mandatory fields, you have to enter some sort of value. So you would enter all zeros in for the sentence related fields. In this case, these are concurrent, so I'm marking no. And then I am marking that yes, a probation before judgment was imposed. Again, no subsequent offender. We're going to go back and enter the restitution. And then if you were to click save this page here, when you go to view the worksheet, you'll see the probation before judgment, the PBJ, it's going to be in red text. Now, one last thing I want to point out here. If you had forgotten to perhaps delete a merged or null prost offense and you got to this step, and then you knew that there wasn't any individual sentence imposed for it because it was a merged or null prost offense, so you entered all zeros here. If I were to change this to no in response to the PBJ question and then click save this page, you're actually going to get this little alert message. It's just reminding you you entered a total sentence of 0. And again, if this were a merged or null prost offense, you want to delete the offense from the list of offenses tab. We were seeing a lot of worksheets submitted with all zeros for merged and null prost offenses instead of them actually being removed from the guidelines worksheet. So that's why we have this alert now, just reminding you if they are in fact merged or null prost to make sure that you're deleting it from the list of offenses tab. Okay, and actually the last thing I want to point out, because I know a lot of people find it helpful, you'll see these information icons also scattered through MAGS. If you click on them, they give you more detailed explanations of what the fields are capturing here. So especially next to this suspend all but field, in the last sentence, you'll see I have this little link in the please click here. And if I were to click on it, it tells you how to enter various sentencing scenarios. And we tried to think of every single type of sentencing scenario that you may encounter. So it's pretty thorough. If you ever have questions, this could be a really helpful document to reference. But again, always feel free to contact, and I'm happy to help you walk through it. All right, so moving on to GLS overall sentence tab. So you can see based on all of the individual sentence information I entered, MAGS calculates the total overall sentence across all of the adjudicated offenses. So here we have a life, suspend all but 85-year sentence with credit for 182 days. Now, just kind of looking at this guidelines applicable sentence, again, total sum of incarceration, credit, and home detention across all of the offenses. That 85 years, I can already tell, is falling below the overall guidelines range of life plus 0.5 years to life plus 5 years. So I am then going to proceed by entering the date of the sentence and the disposition type. So I want to show you what a departure looks like. So I'm going to go ahead and mark other plea agreement. But again, I just want to note, if you ever have a question about the disposition type, you can click the information icon. We give detailed explanations, but you can also always double check with the sentencing judge or the state's attorney if you're not sure, because we definitely want to make sure the disposition types are reflected accurately. Now, whenever you have a sentencing event that involves a crime of violence, MAGS is also going to prompt you to reflect whether it's the original sentencing event or a modification to crime of violence. Now, a recent feature that we just deployed in MAGS, I just want to note, if you were to select modification to crime of violence here, it then prompts you to select what type of modification. A very common type is this Health General 8-507 order. Perhaps there was a commitment under that particular order. So if you were to select this option, when you get to the alternatives to incarceration tab, MAGS would automatically flag the 8-507 order for you as a corrections option that was imposed. So that's just a nice little feature. Again, less work for you that MAGS will automatically do it now. Now, most of these are going to be original sentencing, so I'm just going to go ahead and mark original sentencing here. And then you're going to proceed with the probation length, whether the judge made an announcement that 50% of the sentence must be served before becoming eligible for parole, if victim court costs were imposed, if a no contact order was granted, and if the judge made a written request for parole notification. Now, any other additional information that you want reflected on the worksheet can be entered in this box as well. Anything you want to clarify, go ahead and enter it there. And then we're clicking Save This Page. Now, next, you should be jumping to the Alternatives to Incarceration tab, but I just want to show you another feature in MAGS. It's been in play for about a year now, but it's still going to be a helpful feature, and I want to show you what it looks like. Let's just say maybe you accidentally skipped over that Alternatives to Incarceration tab. You get to the Departure and Submit section, and you want to go ahead and just submit the worksheet. If I were to go ahead, let me go ahead and enter a departure really quick just so I can show you. If I were to go ahead and click submit, you can see that MAGS gives you this alert message telling you that one of the required fields is missing, and it will now tell you the specific tab that is missing the required field. Before, it was just kind of a generic message, and then you were on a hunt to try to figure out which required field was missing sentence information. But now MAGS is going to tell you. So I can clearly see here, I'm missing information from the Alternatives to Incarceration tab. So that's another helpful feature. Okay, so I'm going to jump back to Alternatives to Incarceration. And then I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to go ahead and mark no in response to the corrections option program here at first. And then we're going to go back and change our selections. So then I'll select yes for other forms of alternatives to incarceration. Maybe let's say the defendant was sentenced to outpatient mental health treatment and also ordered to complete anger management. And then let's say 100 hours of community service, and then any other additional criminal fine would be imposed there. So then I'm clicking Save This Page. All right, so as we saw before, now that I have all of the information complete, there is still a departure from the guidelines, because I can see here, as we talked about, that 85-year sentence is falling below that overall guidelines range. So when there is a departure, MAGS is going to prompt you to enter applicable departure codes. Now you can see there's space to reflect up to 3 departure codes. It doesn't have to be 3. It's really just the reason for the departure based on the circumstances of the case. So I'm going to go ahead and leave this one, that a plea agreement was reached for a reduced sentence. And then we'll also mark offender's age and health as a particular reason. Now, if none of the reasons that pre-populate here, again, these are just based on the most common departure or reasons for departure, rather, you can always select other circumstances and then provide the explanation. So we can just say, defendant already serving like the sentence in another case. And it should be the judge giving you this other explanation as well. Okay, so then we're clicking save this page and close. Now, prior to submitting the worksheet, I always recommend that you click this View Worksheet PDF button so you can take a look at the final worksheet before submitting it. I know a lot of law clerks and court staff like to review the final PDF with the judge prior to actually hitting that submit button, just so you can still go back and make any changes if necessary. So one last thing I want to note while reviewing the worksheet here. By guidelines rule, each separate criminal event should correspond to their own separate worksheet. So we talked about multiple criminal events, single sentencing event scenarios, when you often have multiple unique case numbers that are sentenced together. So if we're looking at this first worksheet here, now there's 2 offenses in case number 1122, and they're reflected on the first worksheet here. And then again, if I scroll, I see the 2 additional offenses that are reflected in 2255. And that's correct. They should be reflecting on their own separate worksheet, given that they're considered 2 separate criminal events. But again, there is still 1 overall guidelines range calculated between them. So sometimes I get phone calls when you're viewing the PDF and you know there's a second, third case number in the sentencing event and you don't know where they are. It just means you have to scroll down a little bit to see them. So that's what the final worksheet is going to look like. And then you would simply go back and click submit to submit the worksheet. Now, I'm going to quickly make some changes just to show you how compliance changes based on additional changes. So let me jump back here quickly to the GLS overall sentence. We talked earlier about how MSCCSP binding plea agreements are automatically going to be deemed compliant. So in this scenario here, we know that there's a below departure from the guidelines. But if I were to go ahead and change this to an MSCCSP binding plea agreement and then jump back to the departure and submit tab, you can see that MAGS is no longer flagging it as a departure. And that is because it was adjudicated via an MSCCSP binding plea agreement. You see that in pink and red text here. And then the last thing I'll do, I'm going to go ahead and delete this crime of violence just so I can show you how MAGS takes into account corrections options compliance. So I'm going to go ahead and delete that murder. And then I'm going to jump back to alternatives to incarceration. And this time I'm going to reflect yes and say that drug court was imposed. Now, if I jump back to this departure and submit tab, now it's telling me that this is a compliant sentence based on the MSCCSP binding plea agreement, as well as the use of corrections options, which if I jump back to this GLS overall sentence tab, again, if a corrections option program is utilized, as long as that total sentence is falling within or above the guidelines range, it's going to be compliant. So this 10-year sentence falls within the 1 year to 10 year, and that's why MAGS is saying it's compliant. So I just wanted to point out those differences. Again, if you're anticipating a departure and you don't know why MAGS is saying it's compliant, pay attention to this red text here. That could be a really good indicator. But again, sometimes it's also because sentence information isn't entered correctly. So if you're really questioning it, definitely feel free to contact us and I will take a look at it. Okay, the last feature I want to point out is going to be actually after you submit this worksheet. Now, many of you probably know last year we put in, again, this kind of new feature where as soon as you hit the submit button, you're automatically redirected back to the home screen. That's just to ensure that all of the data is submitted successfully. So let me show you the best way, actually, in the SID number here. Before you click submit, if you want to go ahead and copy the SID number, and obviously just keep in mind the defendant's name, I'm going to go ahead and click submit. It's telling me it's successfully submitted. And now it's redirecting me back to the home screen here. Now, if you were then to go ahead and click include submitted worksheets, and then I can search by my defendant name and then plug in the SID number here and click search. Oh, I get 2 returns there. If I were to go ahead and click the download icon for the case I just submitted, if I scroll down, you'll see the submitted, submitted in red text with the date stamp in the lower right-hand corner. And I know a lot of you like to go back in and get that submitted worksheet with the date stamp in the right-hand corner, just because it's confirmation that the worksheet was successfully submitted in MAGS. So those would be your 2 options. You could either click the view worksheet PDF button prior to submitting and then getting the judge's signature on that worksheet, uploading it to MDEC or Odyssey, or after reviewing it with the judge, submitting. Once you're redirected back to the home screen, just click that include submitted worksheets box, search for your case, and then you can print the one with the date submission stamp. Okay, so that concludes the MAGS demonstration. I'm going to wrap up with 2 more slides. Does anyone have any questions about MAGS? Anything you want me to show you before we wrap up? No. Okay. All right, bear with me 1 second here while I go ahead and bring up one last slide. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about the distribution of the completed worksheet. So once you hit that submit button in MAGS and you print out the final completed version of the worksheet, each jurisdiction does it a little bit differently. So follow whatever protocol has been established in your jurisdiction. But in general, judges or their designees should then be uploading the completed worksheet to MDEC or Odyssey. Some judges manually sign the worksheet. Some court staff will task it to the judge within MDEC or Odyssey and ask them to digitally sign it, after which it then gets tasked to the clerk's office, where they then retrieve it and enter an official docket entry for the completed guidelines worksheet. So it then becomes part of the court record and is then made accessible to all of the other parties. So that's the general process for the distribution of the completed worksheet. And with that, that wraps up the training. If you ever have questions, MAGS related, guidelines related, please always feel free to contact us. Our main number, 301-403-4165. Our general email, msccsp@umd.edu. If you reached out to us before, you know I'm usually the first point of contact. I'm always happy to help. So definitely do not hesitate. So with that, are there any outstanding questions before we want to hop off? I don't see anything in the chat box, but I do want to note that Sarah, my colleague, uploaded a PDF of today's presentation in the chat box. If you want to quickly download that, you can save it for future reference. Any other questions? You can feel free to unmute yourself. No? Okay. All right, well, thank you all again for joining us this afternoon. Always feel free to contact us. And with that, have a great rest of your Friday and a wonderful weekend. Take care, all.